The military academy's courtyard buzzed with tension as Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention, her heart pounding against her ribs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete, but the warmth couldn't penetrate the ice-cold fear that had settled in her stomach. Around her, dozens of cadets and officers had gathered in a circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity, shock, and barely concealed excitement. "Remove her insignia," barked Colonel Harrison, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. His weathered face showed no emotion, but Sarah could see the satisfaction lurking behind his steel-gray eyes. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of months of investigation and military tribunal proceedings. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the brass buttons of her dress uniform. Each piece of fabric that came away felt like she was shedding her identity, her purpose, her entire life's work. The uniform that had once represented honor, dedication, and service now felt like a costume she had no right to wear. The crowd watched in complete silence as she folded each piece carefully, despite the circumstances. Even in disgrace, her military training demanded precision and respect for the uniform. Her movements were mechanical, automatic, drilled into her through years of service and countless inspections. "Faster," Colonel Harrison commanded, his impatience evident. "We don't have all day for this ceremony." Sarah's fingers worked more quickly, removing her jacket, her tie, her polished shoes. The cool morning air raised goosebumps on her arms as she stood in her regulation undershirt and trousers. But she knew this wasn't the end of the humiliation. The whispers from the crowd told her that everyone was waiting for something more. Behind Colonel Harrison stood Major Williams, the man who had once been her mentor, her supporter, the officer who had recommended her for promotion just 2 years earlier. Now he couldn't even meet her eyes. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight, and Sarah wondered if he was struggling with what he was being forced to witness. The investigation had taken 8 months. 8 months of interviews, depositions, evidence reviews, and testimonies that had torn apart not just Sarah's career, but her entire understanding of the system she had served faithfully for 15 years. The charges were serious: violation of military code, conduct unbecoming an officer, and conspiracy against military interests. The evidence seemed overwhelming, the witnesses credible, the verdict inevitable. But Sarah knew something that no one else in that courtyard knew. She knew the truth about what had really happened during that classified mission in Afghanistan 3 years ago. She knew about the cover-up, the falsified reports, and the innocent lives that had been lost because of decisions made by officers much higher up the chain of command than herself. What she didn't know was that the truth was literally written on her body, in ink that had been applied during a moment of grief and rebellion that she had long since forgotten about. A tattoo that would change everything in just a few more moments. Colonel Harrison stepped closer, his boots clicking against the concrete with each measured step. "The removal of uniform is not merely symbolic," he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "It represents the stripping away of honor, the severing of bonds with an institution that demands the highest standards of integrity and loyalty." Sarah felt the weight of every eye upon her. Some of the younger cadets looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot and avoiding direct eye contact. Others seemed fascinated by the spectacle, perhaps seeing it as a cautionary tale or simply a break from the monotony of academy life. The older officers maintained their stoic expressions, but Sarah could read the mixture of disappointment, anger, and in some cases, doubt in their faces. Among the crowd, she spotted Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, her former roommate from Officer Candidate School. Rachel's dark eyes were filled with tears that she was struggling to hold back. They had been like sisters once, sharing dreams of long military careers, of making a difference, of serving their country with honor. Now Rachel was witnessing the destruction of one of those dreams in the most public and humiliating way possible. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the flags that hung from the academy's main building. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the courtyard. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the pulse pounding in her temples as she waited for the next command. "Remove the undershirt," Colonel Harrison ordered, his voice devoid of any compassion or humanity. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading most. In front of her peers, her former subordinates, and her superiors, she would be stripped of the last vestiges of her dignity. Her hands shook as she grasped the hem of her undershirt, knowing that once she removed it, there would be no going back. The humiliation would be complete, and her military career would be over forever. But as her fingers closed around the fabric, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She would face this moment with the same courage she had shown in combat, the same strength that had carried her through 15 years of service. If this was how her career was going to end, she would end it standing tall. She pulled the shirt over her head in one swift motion, her chin raised defiantly. The gasps from the crowd were immediate and audible, but not for the reason anyone expected. Instead of seeing a disgraced officer stripped of her dignity, they saw something that stopped Colonel Harrison in his tracks and sent a ripple of shock through every person present. There, spanning the width of Sarah's back in elegant script, was a tattoo that none of them had expected to see. The words were in Arabic, flowing and beautiful, but it was what those words said that changed everything. Major Williams, who had served 3 tours in the Middle East and spoke fluent Arabic, stepped forward involuntarily, his face pale with recognition. "Sir," he said quietly to Colonel Harrison, his voice barely audible. "Sir, you need to see this." Colonel Harrison moved behind Sarah, his confident demeanor beginning to crack as he read the words that were permanently etched into her skin. The tattoo told a story that contradicted everything in the official reports, everything that had led to this moment of public disgrace. It was a memorial, a promise, and most importantly, evidence of the truth that had been buried for 3 years. The courtyard fell into complete silence as the implications began to sink in. Sarah stood motionless, her back straight and her head held high, as the most powerful men in the academy realized that they might have made a terrible mistake. The tattoo on her spine wasn't just ink and skin. It was proof of her innocence and evidence of a conspiracy that went much deeper than anyone had imagined. But the full truth would take time to unravel, time to investigate, time to verify. For now, all they could do was stare at the words written in permanent ink across the back of a woman they had just publicly humiliated, and wonder how many other truths had been hidden in plain sight. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, and Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. The worst part was over, but she sensed that something much more significant was just beginning. The tattoo that she had gotten during a moment of grief and anger 3 years ago was about to change not just her fate, but the fate of everyone who had been involved in the cover-up that had destroyed her career and her reputation. Colonel Harrison's silence stretched on, and Sarah could feel the shift in the atmosphere around her. The crowd that had gathered to witness her disgrace was now witnessing something entirely different, the moment when truth began to emerge from beneath layers of lies and deception. In the distance, she could hear the Academy's bell tower chiming the hour, marking not just the passage of time, but the beginning of a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. Colonel Harrison's face had gone completely white as he stared at the Arabic script flowing across Sarah's spine. His hands, which had been steady and confident just moments before, now trembled slightly as he reached for his reading glasses. The tattoo wasn't just decorative. It was a detailed account of events that had supposedly never happened, names of people who were officially listed as never having existed, and dates that contradicted every official report filed about Operation Desert Shield. "Get her a shirt," he commanded quietly to Major Williams, his voice barely above a whisper. The authority that had filled his voice just minutes earlier had completely evaporated. "Clear this courtyard, now." But Major Williams didn't move immediately. He was still staring at the tattoo, his mind racing as he translated the Arabic words and began to understand their significance. The names written there were familiar to him, children from a village outside Kandahar, civilians who had died in a bombing that was supposed to have been a precision strike against a Taliban weapons cache. "Sir," Major Williams said carefully, "I think we need to postpone this proceeding." "I said clear the courtyard?" Colonel Harrison's voice cracked as he shouted, causing several of the younger cadets to jump. But the damage was already done. Too many people had seen the tattoo, and some of them understood exactly what it meant. Sarah remained standing perfectly still, her arms at her sides, as chaos began to erupt around her. She could hear whispered conversations breaking out among the gathered officers, could see the doubt and confusion spreading through the crowd like wildfire. For 3 years, she had carried this secret on her skin, never imagining that it would one day serve as evidence of her innocence. The tattoo had been done in a small shop in Kabul during her second deployment. She had been grieving, angry, and desperate to honor the memory of 17 innocent people who had died because of faulty intelligence, and a command structure that was more concerned with covering up mistakes than preventing future ones. The tattoo artist, an old Afghan man named Hazrat, had listened to her story, and carefully inscribed the names, dates, and circumstances of their deaths in his native language. "These words will keep their memory alive," he had told her as he worked, "even when the official reports try to erase them." Sarah had never intended for anyone else to see the tattoo. It was deeply personal, a private memorial that she carried with her always. She had worn uniforms that covered it completely, had never spoken of it to anyone, had treated it as her own secret burden. But now, in the most humiliating moment of her career, that secret was about to save her. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres pushed through the crowd, holding a regulation shirt in her hands. Her face was streaked with tears, but her expression had changed from grief to something that looked like hope. As she approached Sarah, she whispered urgently, "Sarah, do you know what this means? Do you understand what you've just revealed?" Before Sarah could answer, Colonel Harrison grabbed Rachel's arm. "Step back, Commander. This proceeding is not over." "With all due respect, sir," Rachel replied, her voice stronger than Sarah had heard it in years, "I think it is." The tension in the courtyard was now electric. Word was spreading quickly through the crowd about what the tattoo contained, and those officers who could read Arabic were explaining to others the significance of what they had seen. The official story about Operation Desert Shield was beginning to unravel in real time, right there in the Academy courtyard. Major Williams finally stepped forward with his own jacket, draping it over Sarah's shoulders. As he did so, he leaned close enough to whisper in her ear, "Sarah, I need you to know, I never believed the charges against you. I knew something wasn't right about the whole investigation." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing sincerity in his eyes for the first time in months. "Then why didn't you speak up?" she whispered back. "I had no proof," he replied. "But now you've given us proof that can't be ignored or covered up." Colonel Harrison was now packing back and forth, his military bearing completely shattered. He was speaking quietly but urgently into his cell phone, and Sarah could catch fragments of his conversation. Words like containment, immediate investigation, and damage control drifted across the courtyard. As the crowd began to disperse under pressure from the Academy's security personnel, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small group of officers who had remained behind. These were people she had served with, people who had known her character, and had always doubted the official version of events that led to her court-martial. Captain James Rodriguez, who had served with her in Afghanistan, stepped forward. His face was grim but determined. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Is everything written on your back true? Can you prove it?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I kept copies of everything, the real intelligence reports, the actual casualty counts, communications between command and the field. I kept them hidden, but I kept them." "Where?" Rachel asked urgently. "Safe deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box 447. The key is in my personal effects." Major Williams was already taking notes. "Sarah, you need to understand what's about to happen. This is going to trigger a full military investigation, possibly congressional hearings. The people who tried to destroy your career are going to fight back hard. Are you prepared for that?" For the first time since this ordeal began, Sarah smiled. It was a sad, tired smile, but it held a determination that had been absent from her expression for months. "I've been prepared for 3 years. I just never thought the opportunity would come like this." Colonel Harrison ended his phone call and approached the group, his face now a mask of barely controlled panic. "Captain Mitchell, you will report to my office immediately for debriefing. The rest of you are dismissed and are ordered not to discuss what you witnessed here today." "Sir," Major Williams interrupted, "I don't think Captain Mitchell should be debriefed without legal counsel present. In light of what we've discovered, I recommend that the Inspector General's office be notified immediately." "I'll determine what offices need to be notified," Colonel Harrison snapped, but his words lacked conviction. Everyone present could see that he was no longer in control of the situation. Sarah pulled the borrowed jacket tighter around her shoulders and stepped forward. "Colonel Harrison, I waive my right to remain silent. I want everything on record, and I want it now. I've spent 3 years watching my reputation be destroyed to protect people who were responsible for the deaths of innocent civilians. I'm not going to stay quiet for 1 more minute." The courtyard had mostly emptied by now, but the few officers who remained were witnessing something unprecedented. A disgraced captain was standing up to a colonel, demanding accountability, and she had evidence literally written on her skin to back up her claims. Rachel moved to stand beside Sarah, a show of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed. "Sir, I formally request that the charges against Captain Mitchell be suspended pending a full investigation of her allegations." "You don't have the authority to make that request," Colonel Harrison replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "No, but I do." The voice came from behind them, and everyone turned to see Brigadier General Patricia Wells approaching across the courtyard. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic of the entire situation. General Wells was known throughout the military as someone who didn't tolerate corruption or cover-ups, and her arrival meant that word of what had happened had already reached the highest levels of command. "Colonel Harrison," General Wells continued as she approached, "you will suspend this proceeding immediately. Captain Mitchell will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation by the Inspector General's office. And Colonel, you will make yourself available for questioning." The general's eyes swept over the assembled officers before settling on Sarah. "Captain, I understand you have evidence related to Operation Desert Shield that contradicts the official reports." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, standing at attention despite her state of undress. "Then we're going to get to the bottom of this, once and for all." General Wells' voice carried a promise that sent a chill through Colonel Harrison. "The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, doesn't it, Captain?" As Sarah stood there in that courtyard, surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to have been her final humiliation, she realized that the tattoo she had gotten in a moment of grief 3 years ago had just changed everything. The names of 17 innocent people, written in elegant Arabic script across her spine, were about to speak for themselves in a way she had never imagined possible. The investigation that would follow would expose a conspiracy that reached much higher than Colonel Harrison, would vindicate Sarah's actions, and would bring justice for those who had died. But none of that had happened yet. For now, it was just a group of officers standing in a courtyard, staring at the evidence that had been hidden in plain sight all along. General Wells gestured for Sarah to follow her toward the administration building. "Captain, I think it's time we heard your side of the story." 6 months after that humiliating morning in the academy courtyard, Sarah Mitchell stood once again in a military setting, but this time everything was different. The Pentagon's hearing room was filled with senior officers, congressional representatives, and members of the press. The atmosphere was formal, respectful, and tinged with the gravity of revelations that had shaken the military establishment to its core. Sarah wore her dress uniform again, but now it bore the insignia of a newly promoted major. The same tattoo still decorated her spine, but it was no longer a secret burden. It had become a symbol of truth prevailing over institutional corruption. The investigation triggered by that morning's events had uncovered a web of cover-ups and falsified reports that stretched much higher up the chain of command than anyone had initially suspected. General Wells sat at the head of the hearing panel, her expression serious but satisfied. Next to her were 2 other generals, a Congressional Oversight Committee chairman and the Inspector General who had led the investigation. Across from them, at a separate table, sat Colonel Harrison and 3 other officers who had been implicated in the cover-up. Their faces were grim, their military careers effectively over. "This hearing," General Wells began, "is being convened to formally address the findings of the Inspector General's investigation into Operation Desert Shield and the subsequent cover-up that led to the wrongful court-martial of Major Sarah Mitchell." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of interviews, depositions, and evidence review. Sarah had turned over everything she had collected and hidden away, documents, photos, communications, and witness statements that painted a devastating picture of command incompetence and deliberate deception. The safe deposit box that held her evidence had been like a time capsule of the truth, preserved and waiting for the right moment to emerge. The investigation had revealed that the bombing mission that killed 17 civilians had been based on deliberately falsified intelligence. Colonel Harrison, along with 2 other senior officers, had known that the supposed weapons cache was actually a school and a medical clinic. When the mistake became apparent, instead of accepting responsibility, they had created an elaborate cover-up that painted the civilians as enemy combatants and portrayed Sarah, who had questioned the intelligence, as a rogue officer who couldn't be trusted. "Major Mitchell," General Wells continued, "please tell this panel about the events that led to your decision to memorialize the victims of this operation in such a permanent way." Sarah stood and approached the witness table. She had told this story dozens of times now during the investigation, But this was the first time it would be part of the official record, the first time it would be heard by the people who had the power to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. Ma'am, after the bombing, I was ordered to file a report stating that we had successfully destroyed a weapons cache and eliminated several enemy combatants. But I had seen the aftermath with my own eyes. I had helped pull the bodies of children from the rubble. I knew that the intelligence had been wrong, and I knew that someone needed to be held accountable. Sarah's voice remained steady, professional, but those who knew her well could hear the emotion underlying her words. Rachel Torres, who was now sitting in the gallery as a character witness, wiped away tears as she listened to her friend finally being able to tell the truth. When I raised my concerns through the proper channels, I was told to keep quiet for the good of the mission and the safety of other troops. When I persisted, I was accused of being unstable, of having mental health issues related to combat stress. Eventually, I was reassigned to a desk job and told that my concerns had been noted and would be addressed. The congressman who chaired the oversight committee leaned forward. Major Mitchell, at what point did you realize that your concerns were not going to be addressed through official channels? About 6 months after the incident, sir, when I learned that the same intelligence sources that had led to the bombing of the school were being used to plan additional operations. I realized that not only was nothing being done to prevent future civilian casualties, but that anyone who spoke up about it was going to be silenced. Sarah paused, gathering herself for the most difficult part of her testimony. That's when I made the decision to get the tattoo. I was on leave in Kabul, and I met an old man named Hazret who ran a small tattoo shop. I told him about the children who had died, about their names and ages, about the circumstances of their deaths. He said that in his culture, when someone dies unjustly, their story must be preserved so that they are not forgotten. The hearing room was completely silent as Sarah continued. Hazret spent 3 hours carefully writing their names, their ages, the date of their deaths, and the true circumstances of the bombing in Arabic script across my back. He told me that as long as I lived, their story would live too, and that someday, when the time was right, their truth would be told. General Wells nodded solemnly. Major Mitchell, the investigation has confirmed every detail of your account. The intelligence reports you preserved show conclusively that Colonel Harrison and his team knew the target was a civilian facility. The cover-up that followed was systematic and deliberate, and it led directly to your wrongful prosecution. She turned to address Colonel Harrison, whose face had grown increasingly pale as the hearing progressed. Colonel Harrison, do you wish to make any statement before this panel renders its findings? Harrison stood slowly, his military bearing still intact despite the circumstances. For a moment, it seemed like he might continue to deny the charges, might maintain the fiction that had cost Sarah 3 years of her career and her reputation. But then he looked across the room at Sarah, saw the determination in her eyes, and seemed to realize that the time for lies had finally passed. General Wells, members of the panel, I take full responsibility for the decisions that led to this situation. My actions were inexcusable, and the cover-up that followed was a betrayal of everything the military stands for. Major Mitchell acted with integrity throughout this entire ordeal, and she deserved better from her chain of command. It was the first admission of guilt anyone had heard from Harrison, and it sent a ripple of surprise through the hearing room. Sarah felt a wave of vindication wash over her, but also a profound sadness for the waste of it all. The careers destroyed, the trust broken, the years lost to deception and cover-ups. The congressman spoke next. This committee has reviewed all evidence presented by the Inspector General's investigation. We find that Major Mitchell was wrongfully accused, wrongfully prosecuted, and wrongfully convicted. Her conduct throughout this ordeal has been exemplary, and her dedication to truth and accountability reflects the highest values of military service. General Wells stood to deliver the panel's formal findings. Major Sarah Mitchell, this panel finds that all charges against you were based on false evidence and perjured testimony. Your court-martial conviction is hereby overturned. Your rank and privileges are fully restored with retroactive promotion to major, and you are entitled to full back pay and benefits for the period of your wrongful prosecution. The relief that flooded through Sarah was overwhelming. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of disgrace, the knowledge that her military career was over, the pain of being branded a traitor by the institution she had served faithfully. Now, finally, the truth had prevailed. But General Wells wasn't finished. Furthermore, this panel recommends that Major Mitchell receive the Defense Distinguished Service Medal for her courage in exposing this cover-up and her dedication to truth and accountability. Her actions, while personally costly, have led to reforms that will prevent similar incidents in the future. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she stood at attention. Around her, the hearing room erupted in applause from the gallery where her supporters had gathered. Rachel Torres was crying openly, as was Major Williams, who had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates during the investigation. Colonel Harrison and the other officers involved in the cover-up were led away to face their own courts-martial. Their military careers were over, their reputations destroyed by the same kind of public humiliation they had tried to impose on Sarah. But Sarah took no satisfaction in their downfall. She had never wanted revenge. She had only wanted the truth to be told. Later that evening, Sarah stood on the steps of the Pentagon, still wearing her dress uniform, still processing everything that had happened. The tattoo on her spine had started as a memorial to 17 innocent victims, but it had become something more, a testament to the power of truth, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Rachel approached her from behind, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, I know this has been an incredibly difficult journey for you. How are you feeling?" Sarah turned to face her old friend, a smile breaking across her face for the first time in months. "I feel like those children can finally rest in peace. Their story has been told, their deaths have been acknowledged, and changes are being made to prevent future tragedies. That's all I ever wanted." "What's next for you?" Rachel asked. Sarah looked up at the Pentagon, the symbol of American military might and the institution that had both betrayed and ultimately vindicated her. "I think I'd like to stay in the service if they'll have me. There's still work to be done, still reforms to implement, still people who need someone to speak up for them when the system fails." As they walked down the steps together, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. A moment of grief and rebellion in a tattoo shop in Kabul had ultimately led to justice for the innocent dead and accountability for those who had tried to cover up the truth. The Arabic words flowing across her spine had kept their promise. They had preserved the memory of those who had died unjustly, and they had ensured that their story would eventually be told. The media had dubbed her the tattooed truth-teller, a nickname that embarrassed her but also carried a certain weight. Other military personnel who had witnessed cover-ups or corruption began coming forward, inspired by her example. The culture of silence that had protected corrupt officers for decades was beginning to crack, and Sarah found herself at the center of a movement for transparency and accountability that would reshape the military for years to come. As she drove home that night, Sarah thought about Hazrat, the old tattoo artist who had carefully inscribed those names on her back. She wondered if he was still alive, if he would ever know that the memorial he had created had ultimately brought justice to those children. She made a mental note to try to find him the next time she was deployed to Afghanistan, to thank him for his wisdom and his understanding of the power of preserving truth. The tattoo would always be with her, a permanent reminder of the cost of speaking truth to power and the importance of never forgetting those who cannot speak for themselves. But now it carried a new meaning as well. It was proof that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, justice finds a way to emerge from the shadows and into the light. Major Sarah Mitchell had been stripped of her uniform in disgrace, but she had emerged from that humiliation stronger, vindicated, and committed to ensuring that the institution she loved would live up to its highest ideals. The children whose names were written on her spine had finally received the justice they deserved, and their memory would live on not just in ink and skin, but in the changes their story had helped bring about.